Today we start a new series for our community groups, and we're going to talk about the disciplined Christian. The first thing I want to mention is that many of us, when we think of the word discipline, we think of punishment. That's not how the Bible is using the word. The Bible is using the word discipline to mean training. So the idea of being disciplined, being a disciplined person, somebody who has a very disciplined life, this is somebody who has trained themselves to behave or conduct themselves in a certain way. It's not that we're punishing ourselves, right? We are training ourselves to behave in a certain kind of way or to think a certain way. So today, the first text we're going to look at is one of my favorites from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You've heard it at some point, especially if you grew up in the 90s in FCA. This was like one of the only texts that they ever used because it talks about being an athlete. And so 1 Corinthians 9:24 says, "Do you not know that all runners in a race run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable wreath. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one who beats the air." And here's where he says it: "But I discipline my body," or I train my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified from the prize. So he says, all runners in a race run. You need to run like you're going to be the one that receives the prize. He goes, you hardworking athletes do this to receive a perishable crown. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, the Corinthians had a game that was very similar to the Olympics. In fact, apart from the Olympics in Greece, the Corinthian Games was the second biggest international games of its day. And it was happening currently in Corinth when Paul, in the time and the days when Paul would be there. So like not necessarily that Paul was there for the games, but in that same era of Paul's ministry to the Corinthians, they were still having these games. And so he's writing to them and he's saying, look, these athletes discipline themselves. They train themselves for what? For a perishable wreath. It was usually made of some sort of like branches of a tree. And so they get this crown, they get this perishable wreath that they go, look, I won the race, or I was the boxer, or I was this great athlete. And Paul here, what he's talking about, it really begins in chapter 8 for us of 1 Corinthians, but Paul is talking about believers who are strong in their faith and they recognize that they can eat meat sacrificed to an idol. But he says that those people who are weaker in their faith, they don't realize that you can eat meat sacrificed to an idol, and now they're thinking, man, are we serving Jesus and these other gods? And it was confusing some of the people who were brand new to the Christian faith when the mature people in faith were eating meat sacrificed to idols or not. You're going, what does this have to do with with being an athlete? Nothing with being an athlete. Paul's just using that as an illustration. Paul in chapter 9 talks about himself and says, so what I do is I lay down my rights for the sake of the weaker brethren. He goes, I have the right to be married. I have the right to demand that you pay me for my ministry among you. But I lay down my rights so that people can better understand who Jesus is. I have a right, and he's saying to the Corinthians, you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, but I have laid down my rights so that the gospel can be presented to you, and it would behoove you to lay down your rights so that you can better represent Jesus. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 10, still talking about this in verse 31, whether you eat or you drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And then verses 32 and 33, giving no offense to the Jew or the Gentile or to those of the church, but doing all things for the sake of the gospel. So the idea of Paul here, when he says, discipline yourself like a hardworking athlete, discipline yourself for an eternal prize so that you're not disqualified. The point that Paul is trying to make is that the Christian who has freedom in Christ, he says earlier in chapter 10, everything's permissible for me, but not everything's beneficial. And when he means beneficial, he doesn't mean it's not beneficial for you. He means it's not beneficial for the weaker brother. And Paul says, what is more important than my rights? What is more important than my freedom in Christ? What is more important than the liberty that I have to do everything because it's all permissible? What's more important is that I correctly represent the gospel to those around me. And in 1 Corinthians 8 through 11, he talks about how we represent the gospel to the non-believer and how we represent the gospel to the new believer in Christ. So when Paul says that the athlete disciplines himself, and he says he does this, the athlete disciplines himself to receive a perishable prize. He goes, so I discipline my body and I keep it under control. And so the point that he's trying to make is that the Christian life is one that has the gospel as the central aim of how we live. Do you have rights as a Christian? Can you go to this place or that event? Can you eat this food? Can you watch that show? Can you listen to this music? Can you do this thing or that thing or the other? Sure, you have the right to do all that. That's your right as a believer. You are free in Christ. Your works are not the things that endear you to God or distance you from God. You have been bought by the blood of Christ. You have been brought near to God through Jesus as our intercessor. But what Paul says is that what's more important for the believer than their own, I can do this because I want to do this, than their own kind of autonomy, the thing that's most important for the believers is that we represent the gospel correctly. And he says, so I discipline myself, I train myself to conduct myself in such a way where the gospel and not my rights is my primary goal. And so that's what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians 9 when he says that, talking about the athlete who disciplines himself, who trains himself. Paul says, I beat my body. I train myself. I bring my body in conformity to the gospel rather than allow my life to be directed by my freedoms and my liberties. And so how might we think about that? There are things that we as Christians can do, that we have the right to do, that don't necessarily, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, that aren't beneficial. And again, he doesn't mean for himself. He means for those who are not in faith or weak in faith. So we want to discipline our body and we want to conduct ourselves in such a way that the things we are doing for the sake of the gospel are beneficial to everyone around us, beneficial to the lost so that they might come to put faith in Jesus, or beneficial to the brand new believer so that they might mature in Christ, so they might grow up into the things of God. And so one of the areas that the disciplined Christian is disciplined in is that we will willingly lay down our rights, our privilege, our goals in life in exchange for the gospel to be rightly portrayed. Okay? So beat your body, discipline your body, train your body to serve the gospel rather than to serve your own appetites. And that's what Paul's talking about here in 1 Corinthians 9. And Paul writes a lot about this, and we're going to look at a couple of other places in the coming weeks. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.